the real teachings of Jesus is life-changing. It is empowering. Now, you might ask, what do I mean with the real teachings of Jesus? We all know the teachings of Jesus. It's in the 4 Gospels in the Bible, right? It's not that simple. So we need to look for the historical Jesus, who Jesus really was and what he really taught. And to do that, you need to keep in mind the date of composition when you study each Gospel separately, independently. So it starts with the Gospel of Mark. It's our earliest Gospel in the Bible. If you compare that to John, which is the latest Gospel in the Bible, there's a period of decades that went past between Mark and John. Now, a story can change quite a lot in a couple of decades, and it did. If you compare Mark with John, if you study them separately and look at each one independently, then you will see there's a lot of ideas about Jesus, who he was, what he said in John, that is not in Mark or in Matthew or Luke. So what you need to do if you want to follow the real Jesus, what he really taught, is you need to keep the date of composition in mind. And you need to, when there's a discrepancy, when there's a contradiction, you need to look at your most reliable gospel, which is the Gospel of Mark in the Bible. But there's another gospel, the Gospel of Thomas. This gospel has possibly the same date as the Gospel of Mark, or even an earlier date than the Gospel of Mark, making it our most reliable gospel. Now, I want to give you the reason, explain to you why some Christian scholars want to give the Gospel of Thomas a late date, and then I want to give you 12 reasons why the Gospel of Thomas should have an early date. And it's not just my ideas, it comes from biblical scholars. More and more biblical scholars are moving towards an earlier date for the Gospel of Thomas. So let me explain to you why that is. Many Christian scholars prefer late date for Thomas. And the reason for that is simply because if Thomas would have an early date, it would challenge the foundations of institutionalized Christianity. The reason they give for a late date is simply because they say Thomas is Gnostic in nature. Now, Gnosticism is something that started to develop late in the 1st century and more in the 2nd century. And it basically has 2 ideas. It's actually a broad term. Some biblical scholars say we shouldn't even use the term. But there's basically 2 ideas behind it. The one being that it's about secret knowledge, and the other being that our body is evil and we should have nothing to do with it, and we should try and live the spiritual life. Now, the first one of secret knowledge, that idea did not start with Gnosticism late in the 1st or 2nd century. That idea started with Jesus. In Mark, we see that Jesus took his apostles separate, and he taught them some things that he did not teach the rest of the crowd. We see that he used parables in order to keep some of his teachings secret. So the idea of secret teachings is not foreign to Jesus. The second idea, that the body is evil and we should have nothing to do with it, Thomas has the exact opposite idea. I will be going through all of the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas in this channel. And when I do, you will see that the Gospel of Thomas is not Gnostic. It's actually the opposite. Now, even well-known biblical scholar Bart Ehrman, he agrees that the evidence is there for a very early date for the Gospel of Thomas, but he also gives it a date early in the 2nd century, But he says it's because he thinks some of the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas is Gnostic in nature. But like I said, it's not, and we will go through that. Now, let's get to the reasons why the Gospel of Thomas should have a very early date of composition. As early as the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, maybe even earlier than the Gospel of Mark, making it our most reliable Gospel. Okay, so let's get started. Philip Jenkins, a professor of history at Baylor University, he says that the Gospel of Thomas is independent, meaning it did not rely on the canonical Gospels as a source. It had its own source. It was developed independently. He also says that it's closely linked to Q. Now, if you don't know, Matthew and Luke copied Mark, but they also copied another source that biblical scholars call Q. Now, Q in its final form was developed in the year 70 to 75 CE, but its core collection, Q1, must have been developed much earlier, perhaps as early as 45 to 50. Thomas closely resembles Q1, giving it a date of 45 to 50. Also, according to the professors that agree with Jenkins, are professors from the Jesus Seminar. Now, it was a group of professors that came together and they started to study the Gospels and the Gospel of Thomas and the teachings of Jesus. And they gave Thomas a date of 50 to 70 CE. Now, compare that to the Gospels in the Bible. It makes the Gospel of Thomas, it gives Thomas a very early date. Another reason, over half the sayings in the Gospel of Thomas are also in the Synoptic Gospels. But most of the sayings in Thomas are more primitive in form. Now, a more primitive form usually means an earlier version, with other words, closer to what Jesus actually said. If we, for instance, compare the saying 9 of the Gospel of Thomas with Mark 4, verses 3 to 9, I'll just put them up on the screen quickly, you will see that the one in Thomas is more primitive. You can pause it and compare it for yourself if you want. But this is something that biblical scholars that know a lot more than I do came to that conclusion. Another reason, in Thomas saying 12, Jesus says to his disciples, when he's no longer there, go to James. Now, James died in 62 CE, more or less. So why would that saying be written down in the Gospel of Thomas if James were no longer alive? So that also would indicate that Thomas were written before the year 62. Another reason, the Gospel of John was possibly written to refute the Gospel of Thomas. With other words, as a response to the Gospel of Thomas. Professor Elaine Pagels, in her book Beyond Belief, goes into detail, giving a very compelling argument, saying that John was written in response to Thomas. She also explains why the Gospel of Thomas was not included in the Bible, something that I will discuss in another video that I don't have time for at this time. I strongly recommend this book. It's not just Elaine Pagels, George Riley, Helmut Kuster. It's all professors that agree with that idea that the Gospel of John were written as a response to Thomas. So John has a date of 90 to 110 CE. So the Gospel of Thomas must have been written long before that. Another reason, the letter of James is one of the earliest letters in the Bible, possibly the earliest. It was possibly not written by James himself, maybe one of his followers. But James was taught by Jesus, unlike Paul that did not spend any time with Jesus. And some of the ideas in James is very similar to ideas that we find in the Gospel of Thomas. Now, I don't have time to go through them. I will list them on the screen. You can pause the screen and go through them if you want. Another reason. Now, this one, it's something that I discovered. I'm not a biblical scholar, so I might be completely off on this point. I haven't heard anyone else saying something like this, but it's very interesting to me. I think it's possible that Paul quoted the Gospel of Thomas. Now, obviously, the letters of Paul is earlier than all the Gospels we have. So if that is the case, it means the Gospel of Thomas would have a very early date. Now, in 1 Corinthians 2 verse 9, Paul wrote this, "But as it is written, what no eye has seen, nor ear heard, nor the human heart conceived, what God has prepared for those who love him." Now, some Bibles like the NIV will have a footnote there saying that Paul was quoting Isaiah 64 verse 4, because there's no other verse in the Bible like that, and Paul is saying, as it is written. So he was quoting something that was written, and they give Isaiah 64 verse 4. The problem is, go and read Isaiah 64 verse 4. It is not the same verse. In Isaiah, it is about not what God wants to give us, but it's about no eye has seen a God beside you. So it's not that it's different, it's a completely different idea. So either Paul did not quote Isaiah 64 verse 4, or he quoted it completely wrong. Now, there is a saying in the Gospel of Thomas, saying 17, that is almost identical. I'll put them both up on the screen and you can compare them. There's another thing. In Galatians 3 verse 28, Paul says that there should no longer be male or female, we should all be one in Christ. Now, for that time, it's quite a radical idea. The thing is that we find the same idea in the Gospel of Thomas. Now, Paul, if he did read the Gospel of Thomas, he wouldn't have liked it, because a lot of what is in the Gospel of Thomas is against organized religion. And Paul had a very different idea. He was all for organized religion. The thing is, Paul had his own gospel. He calls it my own gospel. And he brags about the fact that he did not receive his gospel by listening to what the apostles told him that were taught by Jesus. He brags about the fact that he wasn't taught by Jesus. He received the gospel instantly. His whole idea about the gospel. So I think even if he did have access to the Gospel of Thomas, he wouldn't have spent a lot of time going through all the teachings and sayings in the Gospel of Thomas. He already had his own gospel and his own idea. Like I said, this point is my own idea. It's something that I came up with, so I might be completely off on this point. I'm not a biblical scholar. Another reason why the Gospel of Thomas has an early date is the Hebrew Bible became more important as time went by. If we compare Mark with Matthew that were written later, we will see that the Hebrew Bible were quoted a lot more, and the author of Matthew tried to link Jesus more and more to the Hebrew Bible, sometimes making obvious mistakes. The Gospel of Thomas, there is no reference to the Hebrew Bible. In fact, at one point, the disciples asked Jesus, or said to him, 24 prophets have spoken in Israel, and they all spoke of you. Jesus, however, responded and said, you have disregarded the living one, who is in your presence and have spoken of the dead. Obviously, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, were not as important to Jesus as many would want to believe. Another reason is that sayings in the Gospel of Thomas, parables, make more sense than sayings or parables in the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I will list them on the screen. I will discuss each one separately in a video. But if you look at the version in the Bible, then there are some problems with that parable that I will show you. But if you look at the version in the Gospel of Thomas that is slightly different, then you will see the ones in the Gospel of Thomas just makes more sense. I don't have time to go through all of them in this video, but like I said, I will discuss each one in detail, and it will become clear that some ideas about Jesus that developed later, especially in the Gospel of John, and those ideas started to conflict with what Jesus actually said, and that caused some of the parables to change a bit and started to cause some problems. Another reason, in Mark 4 verse 33 to 34, it says that there's a lot more parables that's not recorded in the Gospel of Mark. So if we were to discover another gospel of Jesus, we would expect more parables. The Gospel of Thomas is full of parables. Final reason is that Thomas is in line with the historical Jesus. What we see in Thomas is in line with what we see in our earlier Gospels like Mark, Matthew, and Luke. It's not the same as we find in the Gospel of John. So that also indicates that it was written in the same time as the Synoptic Gospels, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. Now, as you have seen, there's no real evidence for a late date, but there's a lot of evidence for an early date. And an early date would mean that the Gospel of Thomas is one of our most reliable Gospels, if not our most reliable. Thank you for watching.